Chinese media threatens missile strikes on Australia. China targets climate activist Greta Thunberg. And the US describes China using the G word. That and more on this week's China News Headlines. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This episode is sponsored by Daily Pnut. The news can be a tough pill to swallow. That's why Daily Pnut gives you a daily dose of news in equal parts humor and substance. Speaking of entertaining and substantial news, tensions between China and Australia are at an all-time high. The Chinese Communist Party launched a trade war with Australia a year ago, after Prime Minister Scott Morrison called for an investigation into the origin of the coronavirus. Why would the world need an investigation anyway? Everyone knows the coronavirus didn't come from China. It's clear the virus came from the US Army, making frozen food out of auto parts packaging. See? Case closed. But a year after Australia's call for an investigation, the Chinese Communist Party has still refused. And they're still mad about it. This week, my favorite Chinese state-run media, the Global Times, said China should be ready to launch a devastating missile strike on Australia. In this op-ed, Global Times chief editor Hu Xijin writes China should be ready to make long-range strikes on the military facilities and relevant key facilities on Australian soil. That could happen should Australia do anything foolish, like send troops to defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion. Last month, a top Australian security official warned of China beating the drums of war. He didn't specifically say China, but it was clear enough, which is ridiculous. As the Global Times says, China loves peace, especially the pieces of Australia left after a Chinese missile strike. China also just suspended its economic dialogue with Australia. But keep in mind, you can't think of Hu Xijin as some rogue newspaper editor. Among Chinese state-run media, the Global Times is the most hawkish, over-the-top mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. But it's still a mouthpiece. This is part of the party's year-long attempt to terrorize Australia into submission. Make it seem like a fight would be so bloody, there's no point in even having the fight. The truth is, when you stand up to a bully, they tend to back down pretty quick. But the Global Times is on a roll this week. They're also targeting Greta Thunberg. You see, according to this new report from the Rhodium Group, China produces more greenhouse gases than the rest of the developed world combined. And climate activist Greta Thunberg finally had some harsh words for China. She said China is ruining future and present living conditions. Enter the Global Times to say Thunberg isn't knowledgeable enough to understand climate change. She's also a puppet of Western politicians. It also describes her as the Swedish teenager who skipped school for so-called climate protests. This is not the first time Thunberg has run afoul of the Global Times. Last year, it was for her support of Hong Kong protesters. The Global Times said she was ignorant, despicable, and nothing but a clown. I wonder why powerful men are so scared of Greta Thunberg. Never mind, I get it. I'm scared of her too. And after the break, Chinese state-run media makes up lies all the time, but this one's hilarious. Welcome back. So it's not just the Global Times that had a week of winning it. State-run China Daily posted this video to Twitter to promote China tourism. Wow, beautiful. Except the video is not from China. It's from the Swiss Alps. And you might think, okay, so they misidentified the country. People make mistakes. But it gets worse. The Chinese Communist propaganda version of the video was slightly edited, including flipping the image horizontally, making color corrections, and seemingly doctoring a stick into the dog's mouth. Wow, they did a good job with the stick. Not a good job with the propaganda. And state-run Xinhua has registered as a foreign agent in the US. It only took less than 3 years for them to get around to it. They had been ordered to back in 2018. Xinhua joins 2 other Chinese state-run media, CGTN and China Daily, as being registered foreign agents. That means they're required to disclose their annual budget and expenditures to the U.S. government. Let's hope that Xinhua's budget disclosures are more accurate than China's other statistics. The National Bureau of Statistics finally released their 10-year census data. Earlier Western media reports said that China's population fell for the first time in 50 years. But now, after weeks of delay, the official statistics show that China's population actually rose. Imagine that. Some China analysts have noticed something funny about China's latest statistics: a sudden, unusual bump in the population growth in 2020. All of this is to push back against the idea that China is facing a demographic crisis, which it is. I talked about that crisis in an episode last week. More developments in the South China Sea. The Philippines has flagged nearly 300 incursions by Chinese militia boats.
Government of the Philippines says it has logged what it calls illegal incursions into its waters by 287 boats with Chinese militia aboard. The country's task force on the South China Sea said in a statement that the incident may prompt possible diplomatic actions.
Yes, diplomatic action like being reluctant to confront China. Meanwhile, Taiwan is denouncing China's shameless lies, specifically about refusing Taiwan access to the World Health Organization. China prevents Taiwan from having access to the WHO because, as China's foreign ministry said, nobody cared more for Taiwan's people than the Chinese government. Taiwan's foreign minister, Joseph Wu, responded by saying, after what Beijing has done to Xinjiang, Tibet, and Hong Kong, no sane person would believe it could take care of Taiwan's health needs, or otherwise. Thank God we aren't under China's control. Please, help us keep it at a distance. Now that's one form of social distancing I can get behind. That and social distancing because of my crippling anxiety around people in general. And U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has decided to make the Chinese Communist Party very unhappy this week. He said there is no reasonable justification for Taiwan's continued exclusion from the World Health Organization. And he demanded the WHO allow Taiwan to attend an upcoming WHO meeting, the World Health Assembly. You know, being that Taiwan is part of the world. But Blinken didn't stop there. He also announced the State Department is sanctioning a Chinese official involved in the persecution of the Falun Gong spiritual group.
China broadly criminalizes religious expression and continues to commit crimes against humanity and genocide against Muslim Uyghurs and members of other religious and ethnic minority groups. Today, I'm announcing the designation of Yu Wei, former office director of the so-called Central Leading Group Preventing and Dealing with Heretical Religions of Chengdu, for his involvement in gross violations of human rights, namely the arbitrary detention of Falun Gong practitioners.
Blinken made the announcement as part of the release of the State Department's 2020 International Religious Freedom Report. And Blinken also specifically used the word genocide to talk about the persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. It shouldn't actually be a big deal to use the word genocide to describe China's genocide, which meets every definition of genocide under the UN Convention on Genocide. But sadly, the U.S. is still one of the few countries to officially use the G word. So, props to Blinken for having the B word. And after the break, Hong Kong is going after journalists with a bat. Welcome back. Nearly a year ago, Beijing passed the Hong Kong National Security Law. It aims to take away as much freedom of speech and press as possible, while still pretending that Hong Kong has its own autonomous government. But when laws aren't enough to stop the free press, sometimes a more direct approach is needed. This is the Epoch Times. It's one of the last independent Chinese language media in Hong Kong. Last week, a Hong Kong reporter for the Epoch Times was attacked by a man with a bat. The assailant hit her with the bat more than 10 times before fleeing in a car. It takes a big man to beat a defenseless woman with a bat. The Epoch Times is a newspaper critical of the Chinese Communist Party. Last month, its Hong Kong printing press was attacked by men with sledgehammers. The U.S. State Department, along with other U.S. lawmakers, have condemned the assault. Meanwhile, Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam is pushing for laws to stop so-called fake news. Those will likely be aimed at stopping pro-democracy media, like the Epoch Times and Apple Daily, from criticizing the Chinese Communist Party. On Monday, we'll have a longer episode about Hong Kong's crackdown on the media. And we'll also have the Epoch Times reporter who was attacked join us on our weekly podcast, China Unscripted. Yes, we also do a podcast every week. In more Hong Kong news, Hong Kong legislators have officially passed a patriotic oath law. Certain high-level lawmakers and public servants have to swear an oath of loyalty to China. And now, the law adds district councilors to that list. But that's not all. The law also includes ways that people could be disqualified for breaching their oath, including by refusing to recognize China's sovereignty over Hong Kong, supporting independence, seeking foreign interference, insulting a flag, as well as endangering national security. Insulting a flag, huh? Hey flag, you look funny. Well, I guess I'm never going to be a Hong Kong local district councilor. The Biden administration is reversing a Trump-era blacklist of Chinese phone company Xiaomi. The Trump administration had put it on a trade blacklist because of links between Xiaomi and the Chinese military. 7 other Chinese companies were put on the same blacklist, but Xiaomi sued and won in a U.S. court. Soon after the victory, Reuters reported that other Chinese companies placed on the same blacklist were considering similar lawsuits. A fantastic development. See, by law, all Chinese companies have to work with the Chinese military. They call it civil-military fusion. And now, Chinese military-linked companies like Xiaomi will be able to sell their hardware devices in the U.S. again to unsuspecting consumers. And this episode is sponsored by Daily Pnut. If you want more daily news that goes beyond what we cover in our weekly headlines episode, check out Daily Pnut. It's a bunch of fast, timely news stories selected for you and available to read on your phone, tablet, or computer. Reading Daily Pnut is an easy way to filter out the noise and learn more about the world news that matters. Join more than 250,000 other readers. Education and entertainment delivered right to your inbox every morning. And the best part is, it's free. So sign up for Daily Pnut now. Use the link in the description below. I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching.